Today we're going to look at 3 different worm farms. A commercial worm farm from a hardware store, a do-it-yourself worm farm made out of veggie boxes, and a worm tower made out of a PVC pipe. You may already be a keen worm farmer and have one of these worm farms that you can buy from hardware stores and so on, and they are great. I'm going to look at one today that's not doing so well and see how I can rejuvenate it. So I've got a worm farm here that's currently inactive. Over the hot summer I lost some of my worms and there's just nothing happening here now. So I'm going to rejuvenate this worm farm, and if we look under here we've got some weeds growing and so on, so it just needs, it's also a bit blocked at the tap here. So I'm going to give this a good wash out and rejuvenate this worm farm. So I've given the worm farm a good clean out. I've harvested any of the worm castings that were here before and thrown away everything that was in the top tray into the compost bin. I also made sure that my tap was working and that water was draining freely from the bottom. So now the worm farm's all cleaned out and we've checked that the tap is working. The first thing to do to get it started again is to line the bottom with damp newspaper. And next we need to add some bedding for the worms. I use a mixture of coconut coir and potting mix. So we've added the worm bedding and now we just wet that down slightly and add some shredded newspaper. And now we add worms to this, and I've got about 500 worms here and some worm eggs, and they're just making their way under the soil. I've added a small amount of food scraps, not too much, and it's best if you can bury the food scraps slightly and break them up a little bit so that the worms can access them beneath the soil, and that also stops your worm farm getting too smelly. And then we cover them with a hessian blanket or towel. Just keep this slightly damp and cover it. And we'll check on those worms again in a few weeks to see if they've started eating those food scraps. To make your own DIY worm farm at home, you'll just need 2 polystyrene veggie boxes, one with a lid. Now if yours doesn't have a lid, that's fine, we can improvise something else later. And if both of your boxes are without holes, that's fine. We're going to make holes in the top box with a screwdriver or a chopstick. And next we line the top tray with the holes with fly screen or mesh. This is to stop the worms escaping but let the water run through to the bottom tray. Next we need some bedding for the worms. Now you can use soil or compost, but I like to use this coconut fibre coir, which you just put into water and it fluffs up to twice its size once you soak it for a while, and it makes an excellent bedding for worm farms. And now just add your soil or compost or coconut fibre, whatever you're using for your worm bedding, on top of the mesh in the top box to about halfway. And on top of the soil we add a layer of shredded newspaper. Mix the shredded newspaper in with the soil or coconut coir and give it a really good water just to get everything nice and damp for our worms. Now you can buy live worms in boxes at hardware stores, or you can even buy them online and have them sent to you in the post. Or if you find a friend with a worm farm, they could donate a couple of handfuls from their worm farm, which would contain lots of worm eggs. Now it's time to add some worms, which I've got here. They're hiding at the moment. There's a couple of them there. These are composting worms, also known as red wigglers or tiger worms. And there'll also be worm eggs in there, which will hatch. Now we're going to give them a small amount of food, and I've got some veggie scraps here. Things like eggshell are good, but you do need to crush them and make them as small as possible. Some people even put these into their food processor before they put them in the worm farm, which is a great idea. And then other veggie scraps, just break them up into small pieces and you'll find that your worm farming moves along a lot quicker. Onion and citrus, of course, you've probably heard they can't go into worm farms. They're best in bigger composting systems like compost bins, so keep those aside. So just place a small amount of food scraps to start with. So I've got about a quarter of the farm here with the food scraps on it. You really don't want to overload it. It takes about a month for your worms to get going. Then give everything a good water so it's a good damp environment for our worms. And you should hear that water trickling down to the bottom box. We can just check and see it is actually trickling down into the bottom there, which is what it's supposed to do. So your top tray should be just damp, not wet. You can make compost tea out of the vermicast that our worms produce. When they turn the food scraps into vermicast, that's gone through their digestive system, and that's safe for us to use to make compost tea. Lastly, the worms are going to need a blanket to cover them, and here I've just used some light hessian material which I've moistened with water and put that on top. You could also just use newspaper, damp newspaper, thickly laid, or a coffee sack. And then we pop the lid on top of the worm farm and keep it preferably in a place where it won't get too hot or cold, definitely not in hot full sun. Some people keep them in their shed or garage or in a corner of their garden under a tree. And if your worm farm has a few gaps like mine does, like this, even though there's mesh inside to stop the worms escaping, it could still let cold air in at night. So you might like to cover the whole worm farm with a heavy hessian sack. The last quick idea I'm going to show you is a worm tower. This is an in-ground worm farm that you bury in your veggie bed or garden, and you can buy commercial ones like this worm tower here, which is essentially just a PVC pipe with holes drilled in it. You bury the pipe in the garden up to here, and then the worms come in and out through the holes onto the ground to eat the veggie scraps that you put into the tube. Now it's pretty easy to make one of these worm towers yourself. You just need a piece of PVC pipe and a lid. You can buy an end cap from a hardware store, or you could just use a pot like I've done here. And then it's just a question of drilling holes all around the pot at the base, and then burying the pipe up to here in the garden.